Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third ESA Junior Faculty Seminar Series. And here are the ground rules. I'm sure everybody's familiar with it right now. So if you have questions and we do not have time to address it, then feel free to stay on for the after party. And it's the same URL, and we're just going to hang out and just have an informal discussion. So today we're having two speakers. I'm going to introduce the first speaker, Noemi Peter, who's an assistant professor at the University of Groningen. And Noemi get her PhD from the University of Amsterdam. Right now she is she's been very active in the lab, the experimental economics lab at her university, and actively promoting experimental economics and working on improving the opportunities for experimental economists at her institution. In addition to our common research interests, she's also interested in gender education and labor. So today's theme is roughly on the gender theme. And we're going to start with Noemi's presentation, and then followed by the discussant Lorji. And then we'll try to wrap up the first talk within 30 minutes. All right, so I stop sharing. So Noemi, can you share your screen?
Yes, I will try. All right, and thank you very much, Jan, for the kind introduction. Shall I get started? Yes, thank you. Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. And thank you for Jan for introducing me. So as she said, I'm indeed very excited about experimental economics, and I'm trying to promote it also at my own institution and elsewhere. Today I'm going to present a paper on gender, willingness to compete, and career choices along the whole ability distribution. And I think this is a very nice paper to promote experimental economics, actually, because what we are going to do, we are going to link experimental data to field data and show the power, basically, of experiments, and that they can actually predict field behavior. So this is something that I'm very excited about. And this is joint work with Thomas Boozer from the University of Amsterdam and Stefan Bolter from the University of Bern. Unfortunately, my co-authors had other obligations today, so they cannot answer questions in the Q&A. Nonetheless, please feel free to comment. I'm very much looking for feedback and comments, and I will try to answer them afterwards. If there is no time for it in the Q&A session, then of course at the end, at the after party. So. Yes, so let me start by saying what we connect to. So there is a large literature by now on willingness to compete and gender. This is the literature that we are connecting to. And the classic paper in this literature is the paper by Nedele and Westerlund. What they did is they invited university students to a regular lab where they did a real effort task. In their case, it was adding up numbers. And so students had to choose at some point between a piece rate payment and a winner takes all competition. So this is the way to conceptualize willingness to compete, whether you would like to participate in a competition. And the main result from that paper is that men are much more likely to choose competition than women. And then this is something that the literature paid a lot of attention to afterwards, and it's been replicated quite some time. So it's a robust finding. And of course, an important motivation for why to do this is because willingness to compete in the lab might relate to competing in the field. So gender differences in willingness to compete could maybe partially explain gender differences in career choices. So what we are doing in our paper, we conducted a lab in the field experiment in Swiss lower secondary schools. So this is still compulsory education. We did the experiment with more than 1,500 students from all parts of the ability distribution. So you should really imagine this is compulsory education, right? So there are normally we're used to university students, right, from the very top of the ability distribution. But here we really also had students who are in compulsory education, they might have very low grades, they might not be able to pursue after compulsory education any higher education, right? So this is really the entire distribution that we have here. And what we did is we elicited willingness to compete in one of two tasks which differ in associated stereotypes, gender stereotypes. And then we linked this experimental measure of willingness to compete to field data on ability. Moreover, we also linked this measure to study choices made more than 1.5 years later. So we went back to the students and we collected more data later. And this data includes vocational career choices as well as academic specialization choices. So this is a rather comprehensive data set. And this rich data allows us to make a number of contributions to the literature. So the first contribution that we are going to make is we will show how the gender gap in willingness to compete varies along the ability distribution using a measure of ability with high external validity. So this is measured in the field. It's not performance and experiment. We of course also have that and we control for that, but this is really an ability measure that is very meaningful in this setting. And one reason to think about the ability distribution is that when you think of competitions, they are often targeted towards the top of the ability distribution. So it's not just the winner of the competition who is of high ability, but competition in general very often are targeted towards high ability people, which can easily create the impression that competing is for high ability people, right? And then we might see that willingness to compete varies with ability. Low ability people might not feel that competition is something for them, whereas high ability people might feel more natural competing. Now, the reason to think about gender specifically is because psychologists argue that gender norms prescribe that women should be modest, and there is quite some literature on this. And if that is the case, then high ability women might behave as if they were of lower ability due to this modesty norm. And that would weaken the correlation between willingness to compete and ability for women. Now, with respect to the previous literature, so as I said, there are many studies here, but most of them focus on high ability samples, right? Many of them at university students. There are also other studies looking at diverse samples, and here I listed a few. The difference with our study is that we explicitly link to this external measure of ability, whereas they do not relate to a pre-experimental measure of ability and do not look systematically along the ability distribution. Now, we further contribute by introducing a task variation. So the standard task is an adding up numbers task, which is a stereotypically male task. And there is a debate in the literature on how much this gender gap depends on task stereotypes. So there are several studies that use a verbal rather than a math task, and some of them find that the gap disappears, but others find that the gap does not depend on the task. So what we will do, we are going to use two tasks. So one is the standard numbers task, so students going to add up numbers, and the other one is a letters task. So here students have to count how many times a certain letter appears in a random sequence of letters. And notice that both of these tasks are actually require still basic math skills, so they are not verbal tasks, also not the letters task. Nonetheless, because this counting letters task, so we show the students letters, student might associate different stereotypes with it. And indeed, we measure the stereotypes and we find that the students believe that they are significantly different from each other. So we do not vary the cognitive domain because we think it's important to separate the cognitive domain from the actual stereotype. So we keep the cognitive domain the same, it's still basic math tasks, but we do vary the stereotype successfully. And then we wonder how this affects the gap. Now, third dimension along which we contribute is that we provide a comprehensive and detailed picture of how willingness to compete correlates with study choices. So here, what I mean by comprehensive and detailed picture is that we look at the relationship between willingness to compete and career choices at all ability levels. So as I mentioned, we look at students from compulsory education. So we also have students from the very low end of the distribution. And we consider the full set of study options in detail, both in the academic and in the vocational track. Now this, in contrast to previous studies, because those either focus on selected samples, typically from the top of the ability distribution, and then look at choices specific to those high ability students, or there are some studies that look at more diverse samples, but they only look at rough outcome measures, so they cannot give a detailed picture. To give some more detail on this, so let me start with the Boozer, Nederland, Oosterbeek study from 2014. They find that willingness to compete predicts the choice of math-intensive academic specializations for students in Dutch academic high schools. And in a companion paper, so to the current paper, a companion paper, Boozer, Peter and Walter 2017, we show that this result replicates in the Swiss setting. So they look in the Netherlands and we look in the Switzerland, and the settings are of course different on a number of dimensions, and the specific way we conducted the experiment differs because they did pen and paper, right? We did it with computers, and nonetheless that results replicate. So, and this is what we show in the companion paper. That paper only uses 17% of the current data set, since it only looks at academic students who are already in academic high school, right? Whereas here we are looking at the entire distribution. So the current paper looks at the whole sample and all specialization options, both the academic, but also vocational career options. And for that reason, it goes beyond the previous literature. So as I mentioned before, there are a number of studies that look at more the top of the ability distribution, such as, for example, 2 studies by Reuben and co-authors. So here, MBA graduates, college students are obviously from the higher end of the ability distribution. There are also papers such as Almos and co-authors and Zhang's paper, which have more diverse sample, but they do not have data on specialization. So they only look at whether you choose, for example, the academic track, but not what you specialize within the track. And nobody has done anything on vocational specialization so far. So we are the very first to do that. Now, why should we do this, right? Why should we look at the whole ability distribution, all options in detail? Well, there are a number of reasons. So first of all, a large part of the population is outside the academic track, right? So of course, we are in the economics profession, we are high-skilled individuals, so often we are a bit self-centered and focus on like university students or the higher ability population, but that's actually a smaller share of the population. And a very large part of the population is outside of this world, and it's very important to know what's going on with them. The second thing that I would like to mention is that there are large differences in math intensity and salaries among the vocational career options. So simply to say that somebody has chosen a vocational education and that's all that we need to know about that person would be rather misleading. You know, when you look at the vocational sector, you have, say somebody gets to train to become a hairdresser, or somebody, or a domestic worker, or somebody gets to train to become a computer technician or a polymechanic. Now, clearly, these are very different types of occupation with very different salaries and very different math intensity. So there is a large variation there. It's important to take a detailed look at this. A third reason is that vocational choices are actually not less gendered than academic choices. So we often discuss gender differences in academic field of studies, but there are also very strong gender differences in the vocational sector. The more lucrative and math-intensive options are chosen mainly by males, and therefore it's also very important to understand what the contribution of willingness to compete is there. And finally, the academic track itself or university itself is a choice variable. So looking at students only in academic education means in a way that we are conditioning implicitly on an outcome variable. And therefore, to get a full picture, it's important to take a step back and without conditioning, just see what the results would be when somebody chooses a specialization, somebody who could have chosen a vocational education instead, right? So these are the things that we look at, and now let me explain how we exactly do it. So our first data collection wave was at the beginning of the 8th grade, right? So I said the students are in compulsory education. This is lower secondary school. And what is important for our purpose of the ability distinction is that there is already ability tracking in lower secondary schools. So in Switzerland, there are 2 main types of school, Realschule and Sekundarschule. So Realschule is for the lowest ability students. These are students who afterwards will not be able to continue to academic education, but they might still continue to the vocational sector. Now, medium and high ability students, so the rest of the students end up in Sekundarschule, which has 2 versions, so the standard Sekundarschule. And in some municipalities, it also has a special version, Speziale Sekundarschule, which is more for students who are already oriented towards an academic track. So that's a pre-academic education. So here the difficulty is that in Sekundarschule we have both medium and high ability students, and therefore what we will do to separate the medium and high ability students, we are going to look at their GPA. So we split by grades, and the students who are above the median GPA we will categorize as high ability students. And also all students who follow this special track, this special Sekundarschule, we also categorize all of them as high ability students. And students from the Sekundarschule, and of course also from the special version of it, can go on to have an academic education, but they can also choose a vocational education afterwards, depending on their grades or a recommendation from the school. So as I said, we went back to the schools again, and we did the second wave of data collection. This was at the end of the 9th grade, so more than 1.5 years later. We followed up more than 95% of the students, and we asked about their choice of post-compulsory education. So here there is a wide variety of choices. So students can choose from the vocational track, in which case they do an apprenticeship at companies or at school partly, and this is the most popular. So it's a very large sector, it's more than half of the students. Then there is an academic track, they call it baccalaureate school. These are basically academic high school. The main purpose of this is to prepare students for university, and about 1 in 5 students makes this choice. And finally, there are a number of interim solutions. So by this, we mean that students do not proceed directly to upper secondary education, but they take some kind of interim road or gap year. So it can be a 10th school year, which tries to bridge this transition. They might do a pre-apprenticeship to prepare for an apprenticeship. They might go for a language stay abroad. So there are a number of options here, and we're going to group them all together, and we will refer to these as interim solutions. Our measure of willingness to compete is based on the Netherlands-Westland study. As I mentioned before, our students perform one of 2 real effort tasks. So they either do a numbers task or letters task by class. And then they play 3 rounds of 3 minutes. So in the first round, there is piece rate payments when students get 25 cents per correct answer. In the second, there is a winner takes all competition in groups of 4, and the winners gets 1 Swiss franc per correct answer. And finally, in the third round, there is a choice, right? So which payment scheme do you prefer for yourself? Now, I'm going to show the basic results just by looking at the data, and regressions basically confirm the same findings. So what we see, first of all, in the first row is that boys are more likely to compete than girls. There is 13.5 percentage points difference, highly significant between them. And this is true both in the numbers and in the letters task. So in the numbers task, it's 14 percentage points. In the letters task, it's 13 percentage points. So there is really not much of a difference between the two. Note that this is not because boys would have a higher performance in the task. So in fact, girls perform better in both tasks and in both rounds. But the difference, so there is no significant difference in the numbers task, but in the letters task, girls perform significantly better than the boys in both rounds. And what you see in the bottom rows is that girls are more risk averse than boys, and they have a lower confidence in their own math abilities. Controlling for these factors in the end would not change the main pattern that we see. So since we have only a short time to present, let me move on with the results. So I want to talk a bit also about the task stereotypes. I promised you that we measured this. So what we did is that in the second wave, we asked the students about the task stereotypes. And what we did is that those who did the numbers task, we asked them about the letters. And those who did the letters task, we asked them about the numbers. So we did this, first of all, we did not want to have a spillover of own performance. So we really wanted to measure stereotypes and not your own experience with the task. And second, we did not want to experimentally induce some kind of differences between the 2 tasks. So if we ask them side by side, we felt that it could introduce some kind of experimental demand effect that you should choose that one is boyish and the other one is girlish. So instead, we only asked them about one task, and we asked who they think is better on a scale from 1 to 5, where 3 is neutral, right? So they could give the option neutral. And what we see is that overall, students think that boys have an advantage in numbers, whereas girls have an advantage in letters. This differs by gender, so girls do not see a significant difference in numbers, but they do find the letters task that they have an advantage, correctly so, right? Girls are actually better in this task, whereas boys believe that they are better in both tasks. So for them, the question is more how much better I am than the girls. So in the numbers task, they think they are much better than the girls. In the letters task, just somewhat better, but both are significant. But there is also a significant difference between the two. So both boys and girls agree that girls have a comparative advantage in the letters task. Now let me move on to the results. So how does the gender gap in willingness to compete vary along the ability distribution? So this graph basically tells the story. So what we see is that high ability boys are significantly more willing to compete than low ability boys, whereas the relationship between willingness to compete and ability is basically flat for girls. And for that reason, the gender gap in willingness to compete is much higher in the high ability group than in the low ability group. Now, when you think about the task, recall that with the numbers, only boys think that the task favors their own genders. And you could think perhaps this is why there is an increase only for boys. Maybe in the letters task, where girls also think that they have an advantage, maybe they also increase their competitiveness. If this is what you were hoping for, I have to disappoint you, because when we split the results by numbers and letters, we see basically the same patterns. So in both cases, the gender difference in willingness to compete is highest for the high ability group, and we see that girls do not significantly increase their willingness to compete, whereas boys do increase their willingness to compete in both tasks. Now let me move on to study choices. So as I said, there is both a vocational track and an academic track. And in the vocational track, there are a large number of different apprenticeships. So we group the choices based on an official measure of math intensity into low, medium, and high math apprenticeship. And we kept the fourth category, commerce apprenticeship, separately because it's just very large. About 20% of the students who do an apprenticeship make this choice. And in the academic track, there are different specializations. The most math intensive is the physics and math. Then we have biology and chemistry, economics and law, languages, philosophy, pedagogy and psychology, and music and art. So it's clear that these are in decreasing order of math intensity. But comparing academic specializations with apprenticeships is more difficult. So for that reason, we are going to run separate regressions for each choice. I also told you that the choices are highly gendered. So here you can see that in the academic track, in the most math intensive choices are dominated by boys, but this is also the case in the vocational track. And so for the results, what we see is that in the medium and high ability groups, so these are students who can choose both vocational and academic tracks, and this is actually a full table, it just didn't fit in one slide. So I'm going to look at each option separately. And what we see that girls who compete are more likely to choose biology and chemistry or physics and math, and also boys who compete are more likely to choose physics and math. Whereas when we look at the vocational choices, we see that girls who compete are more likely to choose a high math apprenticeship, and they are also more likely to choose academic education in general, whereas boys are less likely to choose a high math apprenticeship and more likely to choose a commerce apprenticeship. In the end, you can see joint p-values for joint significance for all the different choices. Now, I'm interested in how this looks by ability level, so where these correlations come from the medium or the high group, and we also are interested in the results for low ability students. And so where the correlations come from, we see that the correlations for choosing the physics and math specialization come from the high ability group, and also the correlations in the vocational sector come from the high ability group. What comes from the medium ability group is the girls choosing the academic education, and this is a very ambitious choice. So in the medium ability group, it is very ambitious to choose an academic education, and we see that girls who are willing to compete are the ones who are willing to make this choice. And finally, in the low ability group, these are students who can only choose from the vocational options. What we see is that willingness to compete seems to shift students out from getting stuck in an interim solution and moving towards securing an apprenticeship. Of course, we don't know how these things relate to each other, but what we see is that those who compete are more likely to secure at least low math apprenticeship, and less likely to get stuck in an interim solution. So altogether, what we see is that boys are more willing to compete than girls, conditional on performance in both the numbers and the letters task. The gender gap in willingness to compete varies systematically with ability, a gap being largest for students with the highest ability. This is because high ability boys are more willing to compete than low ability boys, whereas the relationship between competitiveness and ability is essentially flat for girls. And the results are quite similar in the numbers and the letters task. We also see that there are significant gender differences in career choices, and then career choices correlate with willingness to compete. In general, we see that willingness to compete predicts the choice of more math-intensive or more challenging options. At the top, this means that the students choose a math-based academic specializations. Boys also choose a commerce apprenticeship, while girls choose a high math apprenticeship. In the middle, competitive girls are more likely to choose an academic education. And at the bottom, students who compete are more likely to succeed in securing an apprenticeship position. Thank you very much for your attention. I think I'm on time now, so I would like to give the floor to the others.
Yeah, thank you, Noemi. We're going to just move directly to the discussant. So Laura G from Tufts is the discussant. So Noemi, if you can unshare.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, okay. And Laura, you can share yours. So 5 minutes for discussion.
No problem. Everyone see my slides? Are we good?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
And, okay, well, Noemi, I think I'm saying that right, but if not, we'll talk later. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I think it's really interesting. And so let's go in, first of all, like, why should we care about this paper? I think it's partially because of some things we already know about. So one thing we already know is that it's a common policy goal to reduce the gender wage gap. And another thing that a lot of literature supports is the idea that the gender wage gap is partially driven by career choice. And then the last thing that we know from other literature, all of which Noemi and her co-authors are already pointing to, is that lab measures of willingness to compete often correlate with real world choices like track of study or applying to jobs, things like that. So I think that the value add of this paper, the questions that this paper really gets at are where is the gender gap in willingness to compete largest? And then furthermore, which part of willingness to compete has the largest correlation with career choices? And why do I think that means we should really care about this paper is because I think it and this is my words, not something that the author said, is that I think it really tells us where to aim policy interventions to reduce gender gaps in career choice. And I think that's really important because, these interventions are often the ones that seem to work are kind of intensive. And so we shouldn't be applying them across the whole ability distribution. We should only be applying them to the very top is what I think this paper tells us. So I'll summarize the paper very quickly, even though Noemi already went through all the detail. I think they have two main data sources. One is a lab in the field measure of it's an incentivized measure of willingness to compete that's measured around age 14 for a bunch of students. And they do randomize one thing in here. They randomize whether or not those students do a numbers task, which is adding two numbers together, or counting letters task. And then they link that with a lot of really rich administrative data. One is, I believe, the student's ability, which is measured basically on a mixture of GPA and other academic things at around age 14. And then they also measure that with subsequent sort of career choices. And I'll put like career choices in sort of air quotes here because these are choices of either an apprenticeship or choices of a track of study at that age. And what did they find? They find lots of things. So there's lots of cool stuff in the paper. The two main findings I found really interesting were that the highest ability students are the ones with the widest gender gap in willingness to compete, and that willingness to compete is correlated with some career choices. Okay, so if you might be dating myself here, but some of you may remember, yes, I'm seeing some clapping in there, this Barbie that came out in 1992. She said 4 phrases, one of which was, math is hard. And this was a huge scandal at the time because, we should not have Barbie telling us that math is hard. And I think the really interesting thing about this paper is it sort of tells us is that, maybe math is hard for some women, as it is hard for some men, honestly. A paper tells us that as well. But this paper tells us that high ability girls, they actually generally rarely choose into the high math apprenticeship or the math and physics studies. They only do that at 2.5% and 3% of the total population. So that's still really low. So these high ability girls are still thinking math is hard, okay? However, those high ability girls who choose to compete, that is correlated with a 4.7 percentage point increase in the likelihood they choose the math apprenticeship and a 3.3 percentage point increase in the likelihood they choose the math or physics track, okay? That's huge given these base rates. So what I think this paper tells us is that high ability girls who compete don't think math is hard. And I think that's really important for thinking about targeting policy interventions that we might put out there. So some questions for the discussion for our participants when we open it up is, I think one thing that the paper sort of left me wondering were what are some policy recommendations that we would have from this finding? So one would be where to target interventions, but there might be others. And then another thing that I felt the paper didn't quite get, wasn't using as much as it could have, although I didn't have a lot of great suggestions yet, and that's why I want to open it up for discussion, is how can we better use that exogenous variation in the task that Noemi and her co-authors did, the adding numbers task versus the counting letters task. What else can that tell us about maybe the mechanisms at play here, or about the ability distribution and things like that? So that's all I have for everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. That was great. We have only 1 minute before we have to move to the next talk. So I'm just going to give Noemi like 1 minute response.
Okay, so all right, so let's do then the rest of the discussion at the end when we have the after party, and I hope many of you stay. Let me then just very briefly reflect on the task variation. So one of the things that we thought was quite important is we still stayed at we still stayed with the task. This is in the math domain, but then we varied the perception, right, and varied the gender stereotype, because I think sometimes you see what interventions try to do is kind of paint it pink, right? So you have the exact same thing, but you paint it pink. So you have a flyer which is in one way or another kind of feminized. And then I think these type of interventions trying to attract girls, so at least the way I see it from here, painting it pink is not really going to help to solve the problem. So I think we need to get a little bit deeper into this issue. Why are women not willing to compete in these domains, rather than just pretend that, oh, if you come to this domain, it's very feminine. So I think this is something important to think about. It's not just a perception. It's not just, you know, how we show it, or we put a woman in the picture of advertising this program and then more women will apply, but more like look at it a little bit more deeply and think about why is it that they don't want to. Yes, I see the time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we do have a Q&A after party. I encourage everyone who asks questions in the chat to come to Q&A. So I move to Ted, who will introduce Helena.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, so our second speaker today is Helena Fornwagner. Helena is originally is from Tyrol originally. She many of you will know her from being at Innsbruck. She is now moving this year to Regensburg. Helena has interests in. She has several papers on honesty and fraud in credence goods markets, and she also more relevant to sort of today's theme, has interests in competitive behavior in tournaments. So she'll be talking about that. In fact, I believe the first time I met her was when she presented a paper on the NHL, if I remember correctly. And she herself is a bit of has some experience as a competitor, as for many years she was an equestrian prior to deciding to commit to competing in the field of economics instead. Proving, as I've often said, that ESA members are far more interesting than most economists because we have many more interesting and diverse backgrounds than many economists. Helena, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Ted, for the really friendly introduction. So I will now share my screen and start the presentation. And I hope everything is all right and I'm ready to start. So hello everybody, and a warm and really sunny welcome from Innsbruck, Austria. Yes, I'm still affiliated with the University of Innsbruck, but I already started to pack my stuff and I will join the group of Lea Casar soon in Regensburg. Today I have the opportunity to talk of one of my projects in the domain of competitiveness and gender differences in competitiveness, and the title of the project is Him or Her Choosing Competition on Behalf of Someone Else. This project is joint work with Monica Pompeo from Nottingham and Nina Sardarevich from Bergen, who are both PhD students at the moment. And they are also in the chat. So if you have some questions during my talk, just post them in the chat and they will be happy to answer these questions. What do we do in this project? In this project, we use a lab experiment in order to investigate whether we would find a gender gap in competitiveness, which is that men are competing at much higher rates than women when an individual is not deciding on him or herself to enter the tournament, but someone else is deciding on their behalf. Due to the short format of 20 minutes, I will not be able to really cover all details of our really nice and fun project, but if you're interested, just check out our working paper, which is now available. For today's talk, I will shortly introduce to you some relevant facts. I will discuss shortly the literature to which we contribute with our project. Afterwards, I will come to the research questions we answer. I will introduce to you the experimental design. And then I will come to the, of course, most exciting part, which are our results. Okay, so let's get started. I tell you nothing new when I say that women and men, we do not only look differently, but we also take different choices when we have to decide for our own. So here you can think about all this literature showing gender differences when it comes to, for example, risk-taking, social preferences, or also intertemporal choice. Important for this project is that also when it comes to competitive choices, so to competitive behavior, women have been reported to are less likely to end up in tournaments than men when they have to decide on their own whether or not to enter the tournament. Here, for example, for this literature, you can see the survey by Nederland from 2017. But, and there you see this big orange but, many decisions in life are made on behalf of others. So they are not made by oneself, but you are making decisions on behalf of others. And this also applies to competitive decisions. Let me give you some examples. Think about a law firm. There, a superior decides whom to assign to the toughest, more prestigious, and potentially also more rewarding cases. So the competitive ones, and who gets the safe bets. Also in academia, we have such situations where professors assign their students to more or less competitive research projects. So someone is making a decision on behalf of the students. And also in companies, when we think about sponsorship programs, for example, experienced managers, they choose who they want to work alongside on the more competitive projects and who will get, let's say, the rest. What we claim in our paper is that the gender for a person for which the decision is taken may be a really important factor that influences how worthy or also how capable a person is perceived for whom the decision is taken. And there's exactly where we want to step in, because we want to see, well, what role does gender play in situations where one person decides on behalf of another person whether to enter a tournament or not. So what do? We want to answer the following questions. First, we want to answer if there is a gender gap in competitiveness, if a person who we will call principal in our setting has to decide on behalf of someone else, who we call agent, to enter a tournament or not. What directly follows is what can explain the principal's choice. Why is a principal sending one person to the tournament but not another person is sent? What role does the agent's gender play? Agent characteristics, principal characteristics. We will have a look at that. And last, what is also important is how is efficiency influenced if a principal decides for an agent compared to a situation where a person decides for his or her own. Here we can, for example, think about how the performance in a task is influenced when a person is forced to compete or made to compete, to state it in a software way, or if a person decides on his or her own to enter a tournament. By answering these questions, we relate to two big strands of the literature. On the following slides, you will not have all the literature we also cite in our paper, so this is really just some papers, so we really just have some papers here. So we relate to two big strands of the literature, and the first is all this literature on the gender gap in competitiveness, which has been shown that when individuals decide for themselves, fewer women tend to choose a competitive payment scheme, so tend to enter a competition. As we do not know what is happening if someone is deciding on behalf of someone else, we also relate to the literature which looks at closing the gender gap in competitiveness. So all these different affirmative action programs, or also when we can think here about all these priming papers, feedback, and also advice papers. The second part of the literature to which we mainly contribute is the literature on taking decisions for others. Here again, just short outtake of our working paper. So when it comes to competitive choices, there is this working paper by Thungotten, and he shows that whenever parents have to choose for their children whom they assign to more competitive educational programs or also sports programs, it has been reported so he reports that generally parents choose more competitive educational tracks or sport tracks for boys than for girls. As entering a tournament or making someone else compete can also be seen as taking a risky choice on behalf of someone else. We also relate to this literature which looks at taking risky choices for others, which has been reported that for some environments, people are taking more risk for others, and in some setups, they're taking less risk. So this is also relevant. These are also relevant papers for us. In a broader sense, we also relate to the literature on delegation, but I want to be really clear here. So in our paper, a principal always has to decide for an agent. Whereas in the delegation literature, an individual can decide whether or not to delegate the decision, and if the decision is delegated, one individual is making a decision on behalf of someone else. And what is most related to what we study is this paper by Bottoni et al. And they find that both male and female principals delegate more to male agents, but in a different setting as ours, in a dictator game. Well, let me now introduce to you our experimental design. For our experiment, in order to measure competitiveness, we really use the gold standard in the literature, which is we base our experiment on the experiment by Niederland Westerlund from 2007, which has also been explained by Noemi before. Just let me shortly repeat what is going on there. So in this task, it's a real effort task. Subjects have to add up as many two-digit numbers as possible within 5 minutes, and they face different incentives when doing this. Some side notes: the participants, they always see after they stated their result if it's right or wrong. They are also informed about their overall performance after each stage. We will come to that because stages are the incentive schemes, but they never get to know until the end of the experiment how well they perform in comparison to all others. And as also in Niederland Westerlund, we will pay randomly one stage, and I will come to what stages are on the next slide. Before that, let me tell you that we have 3 different treatments in our paper, and we use a between subjects design. We have the own decision treatment, the gender info treatment, and the no gender info treatment. And now I will provide you some more details. For the own decision treatment, which is our, let's say, baseline, it's really just replicating what Niederland and Westerlund did in their 2007 paper. This means that the subjects who are randomly assigned to this treatment, they first perform facing piece rate incentives, where each subject receives 0.5 pounds for each correct calculation if this stage is randomly chosen for payment. In stage 2, always 4 subjects, so 2 men and 2 women, they form a group and they are competing against each other in the real effort task, and only the highest performer receives 2 pounds and the others receive nothing if this stage is randomly chosen for payment. And where it's getting interesting is the stage 3, the choice stage, because there the subjects have to decide for themselves if they want to perform again under the piece rate incentives, so stage 2, or under the tournament incentives stage, before it was stage 1, or the tournament incentives stage 2. And if a subject chooses the tournament incentives, he or she is perceived as being competitive. So this is just our baseline, and now what do we add? What are our new treatments we add to the literature? We add the treatments gender info and no gender info. In these treatments, at the beginning of the experiment, subjects are randomly assigned to one of the 2 roles. Either they are an agent or a principal, and one agent is always matched with one principal, and they keep their roles throughout the experiment. Principals, they only perform in a non-incentivized trial round in the real effort task in order to get familiar with the task, but their thing is to decide the payment scheme for their agent in stage 3. For the agents, on the other hand, they perform under the following 3 stages, and there you see again, first the piece rate stage as in the own decision treatment, then they are in a tournament against other agents in stage 2, having exactly the same incentives. And then again, the stage 3 choice where our treatments pop in. So in the gender info treatment, the principal knows the agent's gender, and in the no gender info treatment, the principal does not know the agent's gender when they decide on behalf of the agent whether their agent competes in stage 3 or not. So the only difference between this treatment is really providing gender information of the agent, yes or no. In order to make the gender component not too salient, we also provide some additional information, which was also done by other papers before. So the principals, they receive information on the agent's past performance, the age and the residence, but this is done in both treatments. So the only difference between the treatment is gender information, yes or no. We kept the setup really simple, which is that principals and agents' earnings are perfectly aligned. So if stage 3 would be chosen for the principal's payment, and the principal sent their agent to the tournament and the agent won the tournament, then the principal would also receive £4 times the amount of correctly solved calculations. Of course, we also control for a bunch of other things. So we elicit in an incentivized way different beliefs. So the beliefs of the subjects in their own decision treatment, beliefs of the principals about the agent's performance, beliefs about from the agents what they think the principal chooses, and so on and so forth. If you are interested in details, just check out our working paper. We also have this stage 4, which is a stage with which we elicit risk perception, because, as I said, entering a tournament is a kind of risky choice. So we just use the Holt and Lowry lottery task, and this was also incentivized. Then we have some non-incentivized survey questions as well, and we also collect data on basic demographics of our subjects. And before I come to our results, just some more information. We collected the data in Nottingham at the beginning of the year, and we have a total of 688 observations, where 144 refer to the own decision treatment. And in the gender info and no gender info treatment, we have 136 agents and 136 principals in each of the two treatments. We have a standard student subject pool, and yes, ethical approval, and also the experiment was pre-registered. Now let me come to the most exciting part, which are our results. I will guide you through the results using our research questions. So I will start with saying what is going on with the gender gap if a principal decides for an agent. If I would have the possibility to show you really just one slide, it would be exactly this slide. What is going on here is we have bar graphs which show the frequency of men, which are the blue bars, and the frequency of women, which are the orange bars, of entering the tournament in stage 3, which is here, which we have here for the own decision treatment, and then in the middle and on the right hand side, we have the treatments where the principals decide for the agents. And here, for example, the blue bar would indicate the frequency of male agents being sent to the tournament in stage 3 by their principals. And I think what you can already guess by looking at the bars is that we replicate the findings from the existing literature, which is that we have a gender gap in competitiveness when subjects decide for themselves. But, and now we come to our new thing, we do not see a different frequency of male and female agents competing when we let the principals decide on their tournament entry. And here you have the p-values of non-parametric tests, but of course, in order to formally test this, we also did some different regression specifications and we also control for the diff in diff, and this is different here. So we can conclude that there is no gender gap in competitiveness if a principal decides for an agent whether to enter a tournament or not. The second question is, of course, why? So what can explain the principal's choice? And having our two different treatments, so one where the principals know the agent gender and one where they don't know, we can test here for the difference in difference, and this test shows us that there is no causal effect of providing gender information on the principal's choice. So according to our results, providing the principals the agent's gender does not influence their choice. What we also do is we use different probability regression specifications to explore, to better get to know what is driving the principal's choice. And what we find in, again, regressions, I have not the time to discuss the regressions with you today. So just a summary here is that the principal's beliefs matter. So principals who think that their agents perform better compared to other agents, they're more likely to send their agents to the tournament. Interesting here is we find no gender difference in the evaluation of the agent's performance. So principals evaluate the performance of men and women, the same performance, being completely the same. Principals who believe that their agents would prefer to compete, they're also more likely to send them to the tournament. And principal and agent characteristics, they do not play a role, but the principal's preferences. So those principals who are more risk-seeking and more competitive, they are also more likely to send their agents to the tournament. Last thing is efficiency. I'm really brief here. So with respect to efficiency, we compare the 3 different treatments and we use 3 different efficiency measures. And what you can see from this slide is if efficiency is defined as the average performance of those competing in stage 3, over all 3 treatments, we do not find a difference. We do find a difference with respect to the average performance of those winning the tournament in stage 3. And here we see that the average performance is higher for those who decide themselves to enter the tournament or not, compared to the situation where a principal decides for an agent. And with respect to the average earnings of those competing, we do again find no difference across treatments, again using non-parametric tests and regressions. Let me wrap up. So what do we show with our paper is that there is no gender gap in competitiveness if a principal decides on behalf of someone else, an agent, to enter a tournament. We can rule out with our setting that the agent's gender matters for the principal's choice, but we show that principal's beliefs and also principal's preferences play a role whether to send their agent to the tournament or not. And we have mixed results with respect to different efficiency measures where, according to some, it's better to let people decide on their own to enter a tournament, and for others, it does not make a difference. I thank you for listening. It was great to talk about our paper here today. And if you have any questions or some other remarks or notes, just drop me an email, and I'm really looking forward now also, Ernesto, to get to know what you think about our project. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. And indeed, on that note, over to you, Ernesto Reuben. Please fire away with your comments.
Sorry, Ted, could you just repeat it?
I was just thanking you and asking Ernesto to go on ahead.
Okay.
All right. Yes, and we can. So is that you showing your screen now, Ernesto?
Okay.
You ready? Not yet.
Ready.
There we go. Good. Thank you.
Okay. So this is it's a very interesting paper. It's a very nice paper, Helena. I enjoyed reading it, and actually, you know, I hadn't actually thought about this, even though I've been working on this literature for a while, and it opens like a whole brand of like follow-up experiments that you can think about. I was very excited while reading it, and in fact, as I was reading it, like a lot of questions came up. So a lot of my discussion is basically based on those questions. The main point of the paper is to make this point, is to say the gender gap in competitiveness disappears when other people when a principal is making this choice, right? So you place this literature in the literature basically of the, on the literature of showing what are the conditions under which the gender gap in competition disappears, right? I think the paper is somewhat broader on this, right? And I thought about two ways in which, let's say, a paper could be seen. One is to say, it's just interesting on its own to see what happens when principals choose, right? So from this point of view, it's like saying the main point of the paper would be to understand what's the principal's choice. That comparison to what the agents do when they choose themselves would be less prominent just because it's a different situation, right? And here you have a lot of insights, I thought, but I think there's still a lot of things that you could do, right? So I was trying to think, what are the reasons, if we just concentrate on the principle, why there could be a gender gap, right? Because from the principal's perspective, it's not as obvious following the literature why this would be the case. Here, you could think of things like maybe there's differences in actual performance. This you show, and previous literature has shown that this is usually not the case, right? So we don't see that. Then there could be just that principles there's gender differences in the beliefs of the principles, right? And here, I mean, the data that you have is actually, the important thing is the relative belief. So how well a person compares to others, since it's a tournament. And you have the data on the updated belief. So the principals could see the performance in stages 1 and 2, and then they would form a belief about the relative performance of the agent, and they will make the decision choice, right? In the paper, you don't explicitly show whether these updated beliefs are different depending on the gender of the agent. It would be nice to see that, and it would be nice to try to back up a little bit and say, is this because of differences in priors, or is this because of some difference in the updating, which I think you could get at by looking at the relationship between what they see and their beliefs. And then it could also be an issue of how much weight you give to the beliefs. Here you actually do show that when it comes to what they see, there's no gender difference, but you don't look at the belief part, right? So that would be nice, a nice thing to see. Now, other reasons why there could be a gender gap through the principal's choices is that the principals are in some way are taking the agent's wishes into account, and they just have different beliefs about the preferences of the agents themselves, right? Now here, you do mention in the paper the principals think men, you know, they would choose to compete more, right? And you also show that, you know, irrespective of gender, principals like to choose according to the agent's wishes, or according to what the agent would do. Here, the issue though, it would be nice to be able to separate this a little bit from what is it that the principal is just trying to please the agent, or are they just, you know, following and maximizing their income, right? So if I think the agent is good, I'm probably going to think that the agent will choose to compete, and maybe I don't care about the agent at all, but I will choose to compete as well because I think the agent is good, right? So that's not completely teased out in the paper, and it will be able to know what is going on here. And then finally, there's a question that just comes up, and you sort of have to dig it in, and even then you cannot really tell, is to say whether the principal's gender matters, right? Because it could be that just by switching to the principal's deciding, you're switching one gender gap for another, right? So no gap depending on the gender of the agent, but there could be a gap depending on the gender of the principal. It seems that that's not the case once you control for things, but it would be nice to see whether it exists without those controls. So this is one way of looking at the paper. The other part, which you sort of touch on too, is to say, is this, you know, if we compare the two settings, is this a good idea or not, right? So here then is more the focus on what are the consequences of the principal choice compared to when individuals are choosing. And here it's more about, you know, think a bit more carefully about what is it that makes better or worse choices for principals, right? So we saw that if the goal of a policy is just to reduce the gender gap in competition based on the agent's gender, this works, right? So this eliminates that. But usually that's not the only goal, right? You could say, well, we also want to improve selection into the tournament, irrespective of gender. And I wasn't fully convinced that the current analysis gets to that. In particular, yes, you look at the performance of the agents who are selected into competition, but you also control for their past performance, which I didn't quite understand why was necessary from an efficiency point of view. To me, it would be simply just, you know, say if there's, because of some, let's say, issues, there's some initial differences in performance between treatments, you could just look at the rank and say, is the mean performance of those that are selected to compete different across the two treatments? And then is the expected earnings different, right? You focus on basically the performance and the winners and the earnings, but this depends a lot on the matching that happened, right? So you could actually look at just what would be the expected earning if they would be matched randomly with the performance of others there, and it would give you a better picture and maybe more power to be able to say whether there's a difference here or not. And then it would also be nice to know who wins and who loses from this, right? So if the print are the high performing men or women affected by this? Is it the low performing ones? Just to have a sense of not just the average effect, but also how this affects different people. And then a little bit a question of why, right? So this is a little bit what I missed a little bit, is why would we see, let's say, a difference between agents and principals when they're selecting, right? It could be that there could be some positive effects if principals' beliefs are more accurate, right? They're making better decisions because maybe they're not affected by overconfidence or attribution biases. At the same time, it could also be that they're also less affected by their preferences, right? So, you know, it's not the same to have to compete than to have to perform on their competition than just to choose, let's say, someone else to perform. So if you're affected less by things like risk and competition, then you could be making better choices purely from an efficiency in terms of performance type of effect. And then this is more of a, you know, a goal of any policy you could also think about is the welfare effect, right? This is a lot harder to tell. Interesting to, you know, at least give it a shot. And is to say, well, here we're really taking people's choices as, you know, this is what maximizes their welfare. Then, you know, there's basically two things here. So on one hand, principals could improve things because maybe they're not affected by biases in beliefs, like overconfidence. At the same time, they might not be respecting the preferences of the agents, something like preferences against risk and competition, and these two things need to be weighted against each other. It would be nice if you can say something about that as well. So that's all I have. So thanks for the nice paper, and yeah, we can talk more during the after party.
Yeah, thank you, Ernesto. So yes, as Ernesto just mentioned, we know it is the top of the hour, so it is the end of the timetable, the part of the events. So it just falls to me, at least, to close the formal portion, to thank Noemi and Helena for the talks, to thank Laura and Ernesto for being discussant, and once again to thank all the attendees for joining and for your comments in the Q&A. And so we'll now move into the after party portion. And for those of you who do have to leave, we hope to see you again next week.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Just the way it works, we have to allow you to talk. So you can either raise your hand or maybe type in a message in chat, so we know you have a question. I saw in the first paper in particular, we didn't get a chance to address the questions. I think, Tracy, you had a question, right?
Yeah, and I just realized that in the Q&A there were questions in the meantime, but somebody answered them by referring it to the after party. So now I see them.
Yeah.
So maybe I can briefly address.
Yeah, so if you raise your hand in the participant tab, there's a, if you click on participants, you'll be able to raise your hand, and and then we can unmute you.
Are there any hands raised? Do you see that?
I don't see it,
So let me just take one question from the Q&A then in the meantime, and then if somebody raises hand, then I will stop talking.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe I can ask all the panelists to unmute themselves. So
So somebody asked how were the students sampled, and so this went via the schools. So we contacted the schools, and then when the school agreed, usually they had several classes, and then basically the whole class participated. So it was not by student, and that also means that they had some idea about. Another person was asking against whom they were competing. So in the lab, you typically do not know the other participants, and here you know your classmates. On the other hand, it was anonymous, of course, so we did not tell them, okay, you're competing specifically against this person, right? But you had somewhat of a better idea about the ability of your potential competitors in this environment than you have in a classic lab experiment.
yeah, so I unmuted a number of people who I remember raised questions in the chat. So Alice raised a question, I think, about sampling. Alice, you can unmute yourself if you want to ask the question. Yeah, go ahead. You are unmuted. Oh, okay. Also, I think Boone had a question. I unmuted the people who I remember. Anyone?
I think I answered his question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I actually have a question about this literature in general. So, which is, you know, going into why women compete less, which is, there's always in the task, in the needle vestidont task, there's the monetary incentives. So one issue is, I don't know if anybody looked at the simple leaderboard, which is being ranked. So in the end, there's no, let's say, so in the contest literature, there is a theory paper on contest for status, which is by Benny Madovano and co-authors in the 2007 JPE. And so the disutility of being lower, so the utility function of being ranked is, you know, the number of people below you minus the number of people above you. So that's the theory model. And so has anyone looked at whether people have a disutility, whether women have a higher disutility from just the simple act of being ranked ex ante? So is there a sort of embarrassment or, you know, I have more disutility from being embarrassed to not winning the tournament compared to the utility from being at the top. So in other words, how is there a way to tease out, you know, the monetary incentives versus the sort of status, utility over status? So Madovano and co-authors sort of, you know, call this whole ranking business status. And if you think about the tournament, you know, there's essentially one winner and everybody else are losers. So I'm wondering what your thoughts on that is.
I think there is a paper on that gives feedback even if you do not choose the competition, but I do not remember exactly the details.
Yeah.
So I think it is probably part of the story. One of the reasons why in our paper we wanted also to look at variation along the ability distribution. And here we measure ability. That was actually also another question, how we measure ability by the grade. So partly by the grade, partly by the academic track. Because this is a very, this is really distinct from performance in the experiment. So performance in the experiment, right, I can have a high score because I had a lucky draw. And I might not know how I compare to other people. But this type of ability measure that we look at in the paper, here I know that I'm a RA student, so I know that I've been ranked in the lowest possible education level as compared to others, right? And when these girls from the RA level, from the lowest possible level, they compete to a similar degree to the girls who are from the highest possible level. So that is very different. That I think that is difficult to say that you do not know where you are in society as compared to the others. This is something that you very clearly know, and nonetheless you don't compete. So this is why we think it is interesting to look at this setting and think a little bit about modesty, because there have been other, not competitiveness, but other settings where people have argued, you know, people don't want to self-promote because there is this modesty norm. They don't want to say, you know, I'm the best. And if you think about competing, in a way, that's what you're saying, right? I'm entering the competition. I'm saying, I'm really good. I can win this, you know, I'm so good. I can compete against the others and show that I'm better than them. I think there is an element of this, which is about this. And I think it's very difficult to, it is something distinct from the money that you win. Mm-hmm. That is my intuition. Of course, this is not something that we can in the end like pinpoint or show exactly how it operates. But I think this is why it's very interesting to look along the ability distribution that is has a very high external validity measure.
Yeah. So I see Alessandra Casal.
Hi. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I want to say to all of you, you know, great work and great paper, and I'm looking forward to read the longer version. And I would like to add something to both your work and in general to what Jan said about the, you know, just to make sense of this entire literature, and also what Naomi just said a second ago. Why could it be so hard for women to say, wow, I'm so good, just I'm gonna go full ahead and compete? Well, we can see this from a theoretical perspective by looking at evolutionary psychology, and we don't need to go back to when we were hunter-gatherer, because the cost and benefit of reaching high status, competing, showing off that you are at the top of your game, and you are aggressively pursuing high risk, high rewarding enterprises is still very different for men and women. And I'm looking at this from a biological perspective. And of course, then there is culture that comes and effect too, because it's not, you know, nature or nurture, it's both nature or nurture. And sometimes I think in our work, we are forgetting the nature part. As women and men too, we have finite resources. So constantly throughout all of our life, we need to optimize where to put our effort. Especially we divide between two types of effort. It is mating effort, which is capturing a mate and retaining a mate, and also reproduction, because our mind evolved through the same principle as our organs, our eyes, our heart, but also our mind. So it's natural selection and sexual selection. Our effort, it's mating and reproduction. And reproduction means competing directly for your children. And it means also sometimes, well, I could speak like for 20 hours about this. But what are we seeing here, especially in this sample of a teenager, of very young people? None of them are married. None of them are children yet, especially 14, 15, 16, 18 years old. They are at the very top of looking for a mate. And how do women and men look for a mate? By competing over what the other sex find highly attractive. Women, what do they find highly attractive in a mate if they are heterosexual, but also if they are homosexual? Well, they find proxies for resources, capacity of acquiring high resources. Therefore, men that signals that are highly competitive, that go aggressively over resources, they become irresistible to women the world over. This goes across culture. What about women? Well, women have to be competitive of what is attractive in the eyes of men. And even among chimpanzees, so this go across, you know, it's across primate, men simply don't put a premium on women that are highly competitive, acquiring resources. It's part of the cooperative breeding hypothesis. It's part of the cooperative enterprise of raising children together, where each sex put what they are endowed with. So this is to say, it's important that we start doing this experiment also with subjects that are not at the pinnacle of their interest in mating. Otherwise, we are going to find people adopting the social norm appropriate for that life stage. I did lots of experiments when I have women that are already married, women that have already children, and there is whatsoever no difference, because now the effort of the individual switch from capturing a mate towards competing for children and other things. And the one last thing is that there is an entire literature emerging now that shows that women that reach the top and win, they pay at the household level. There is an article in the New York Times, even a year or two ago, by Mulainatha. He talked in terms of development. He's a great development economist, and he never put it down to the biology, but he was raising the point that around the world, as women are, for example, entering into microfinance institute, being allowed to release their credit constraint through microfinance and other things, and they are making it a little bit better economically. What do? They suffer at the household level. There is an increase in intimate partner violence. There is an increase in divorce. We saw that women that win the Oscar for best actresses divorces twice as much the rate as men who win the Oscar as best actor. We see in Northern Europe, Sweden and Norway, politicians that win the race where they were really tight, like 49.9%, 40. So it was really random if they won the political spot or not. They divorce at a much higher rate. So I think what we're doing here, it's great because with our experiment, we are capturing something that it is fundamental. And that something needs to be linked, I think, to life stage, because it's interesting how for men, throughout all of these experiments, no matter how is the condition, there is no much difference between the male. Male are so very stable in their preference to enter to compete or not. But for women, you change the treatment, you change the life stage, you change anything, and you see women behavior changing dramatically. So I think, this is all great. Is more extra pieces of the puzzle that we are trying to put together here on the determinants of human behavior, in particular gender behavior. So thanks a lot. I'm sorry if I was rambling for a long time, but Jan was asking such a good question, because we have to go back to the theory to start placing all of this work in a general framework that makes us understand what motivates us.
Thank you, Alessandra. So Boonhan has a question. Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thanks. This is for Helena. This question just popped up. I was just wondering, noted that there are no gender differences in principals' beliefs about agents' performance, but do you see gender differences in beliefs by the agents themselves?
Thanks for the question. Hi. Let me remember. I would guess, but I have to look it up. We have so many different beliefs elicited, as I said. I have to guess here, but I would also think that in line with the existing literature, we find that women believe that they are worse than men. But I will have to look it up, and I will be happy to just write you an email on that. If you're
yeah, because this is an interesting thought, because it's established that men tend to be more overconfident about their performance, but these do not translate to perceptions by principals about others. And I was just wondering what might be the case here for a lack in differences in beliefs about the behavior of others. Is it that gender is not actually salient in your gender treatments enough to drive differences there in beliefs. I don't know if that makes sense, but it could be that the gender is not salient enough in the gender treatment. This may also explain why you don't find differences between your gender treatments and no gender treatment.
This is it's a good point. I mean, when we set up the experiment, of course, we thought a lot about how to implement gender, but not to make it super obvious that it's about gender. So we were really discussing this over and over again. And I would say that also according to the papers that are already out there, we found the best middle way. Well, if we really want to have a clear answer to your question, I mean, we would really need a treatment where we just have, in the one treatment, just only gender, and the other treatment, no information about, at all about the agent. But as we do not have this, I cannot give you an answer here. But yeah, fair point, definitely.
That's right, thank you.
Thank you.
And Mallory, everybody can speak at any time. I just saw there was a question from Mallory. Would you like to ask that question?
Background noise on their part. We can go ahead and read the question because they can't speak right now.
Yeah. Okay.
The question is there any concern that, for Noemi, is there any concern that your measure of ability has competitiveness in it also? That more competitive people will be more successful in the school environment?
Right, yes, so that is a very good question. So of course, what comes first, that's a bit difficult to determine, right? So what we do in the 8th grade, we measure the competitiveness with the experiment, and the way we measure ability is something that's given externally by the school. So the tracking is not really a choice. That is something that the teachers determined, whether you are in the lowest track or whether you are in the standard track, and whether you are allowed to go into this elite track. And the grades, of course, that depend on your performance. But we asked them about their grades before, right? So in that sense, these variables come from before the experiment. Of course, it would be still difficult to argue that they are completely predetermined, in the sense that competitiveness, we measure that in a particular point in time, but you know, there might have also beforehand, this was something that they carried with themselves. So I definitely think that we cannot state, we cannot kind of take them apart completely from each other, right? So when you see that the high ability boys are more competitive than the low ability boys, you know, you could argue that one of the reasons why these boys are in the higher educational track, because they were like competing in their grades, for example, they were competing to get better grades. So that is a possibility that we cannot exclude. Nonetheless, you still see that there is a difference by gender. So what I would find difficult in that explanation, so there are two things. One is that these are not really study choices at this stage. So this is really about ability. This is something how the teachers characterize them. And this is about the same material, how well they are able to process it. So I think a lot of that is really about what they are capable of, not what they like prefer, like which study field they would like to have. And the second thing is that if you argue that competitiveness drives ability, then it's difficult to explain why there are no gender differences in. So if women are less competitive, and you would need to be competitive to have, say, high grades, then why is it that women have high grades? So this is not the dimension where we see these stark gender differences. It's really the choice of field of study where we see these gender differences and women shying away from certain study field. But it's not that they are not able to perform at a high level in school, right? So you either have to think that these things operate very differently by gender, or you go with the other explanation that it's probably more likely that competitiveness drives more the choices and not so much the ability. But I 100% agree that this is not something that we can claim that, you know, one was determined with before the other and they cannot have relation. So it is possible it captures part of it. It is clearly just a correlation that we are showing, right? Not a causal effect. Nonetheless, I think one interpretation has a higher likelihood than the other. And I think it is interesting to think of competitiveness as something that's coming later. And thanks for the question. It was also asked in the Q&A.
All right, any other questions? There's a Q&A. let's see. Okay, all right. There's, let's see, there were 2 chat messages. Okay, I think it was just Catherine saying that. So Catherine gave me a reference for, Catherine Echo gave me a reference for the status preference. And that's Arthur Schramm, Jordi Brandts, and Clarita Gehani, which is called Social Status Ranking. So the title starts with Social Status Ranking. It was published in Experimental Economics in 2019. So thank you, Catherine. I'll go check that out. Any other questions?
May I just say thank you to Ernesto for the feedback, and also to you all to setting up this webinar, something I missed up to now. So thank you all for your feedback. It's really, really good to get the feedback. I see Naomi nodding, so.
Yes, I have the same. I'm really grateful. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for the valuable feedback. And thank you so much, Laura, for a very kind discussion.
Yeah, so thanks for the speakers, to the speakers and the discussants. Great job. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye, everyone.